A disturbing news just came from the Soviet Union. The official telegraph agency of the Soviet Union agency announces that an incident has taken place at a nuclear power plant, causing casualties. The incident occurred in Chernobyl, Ukraine, where there is a nuclear power plant. According to telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, one of the 3 atomic reactors has malfunctioned.
Let's go to that night of April 26, 1986, in fact. Let's go back a few hours. To the afternoon of April 25, 1986. It's a strange afternoon. We would define it in hindsight, a decidedly singular afternoon, in which many phone calls are coming into the chief engineer's office. Bryukhanov is the key character. One of the key characters in this story is the one who directed the construction of the Chernobyl power plant, a plant that is not yet completed because the 4 reactors that were operating in that April of 1986 were not all fully tested. There are 2 more under construction. They are all of the reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny type. It's an extremely economical reactor. Why? It is based on simpler technology and principles that are considered impactful. As for the more acceptable costs for an economy as fragile as that of the Soviet Union. But the reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny reactor also has a fatal flaw, which has not yet been discovered and will be discovered just a few hours later.
Welcome, Luca Romano, physicist and science journalist known as the Atoms Advocate on Facebook and other social media. What kind of power plant was the one in Pripyat?
So the Chernobyl power plant was a dual-purpose civil-military plant. It had 4 reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny, 1,000 reactors. The reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny was a fairly common reactor model in the Soviet Union. It was a graphite water type, meaning it used water for cooling and then the steam generated from the boiling water to turn the turbines, and graphite to facilitate fissions by slowing down the neutrons. And this type of reactor has technical characteristics that can make it unstable under certain conditions. It has,
however, some
advantages. Obviously, it's not that the Russians are stupid. They were stupid. It's very flexible from the fuel point of view. I mean, a power plant like the one in Chernobyl. It offered advantages from an economic point of view, the production of plutonium for military use and scalability. The same model could be easily scaled up to higher powers. The disadvantage is that under certain conditions, what is called a positive void coefficient is created. That is a feedback situation. A feedback loop where an increase in power causes an increase in power. It's like saying it goes into a vicious circle. This, of course, was avoided in most circumstances, but at Chernobyl, what wasn't supposed to happen happened.
We were saying the afternoon of April 25, 1986, office of the chief engineer, Bryukhanov. Bryukhanov has been under pressure from his superiors for months. He has to carry out a series of tests involving reactor number 4. These are tests, we would say routine, but in reality they are somewhat particular tests. Because the Chernobyl plant is not just for producing electricity, which the Soviet Union and the Soviet Republic of Ukraine in particular are starving for. It also serves to produce plutonium, and plutonium has only one purpose: to fuel nuclear weapons. So it's a dual-use facility, so it's a very delicate plant. So it can represent a strategic target for first strike by NATO or for an attempt at sabotage. And it is precisely for this reason that a particular test is being studied, a test that is needed, or at least should be needed, to understand how quickly the emergency systems can come into operation. How long does it take for the turbines to continue spinning and therefore generating energy, even in the event of a complete shutdown of the reactor? And how long does it take for the emergency system, including the cooling pumps, to start operating with the diesel generators? It's a dangerous test. Bryukhanov knows this very well, and that's also why he would like to carry it out. In broad daylight, perhaps in the afternoon, perhaps with an experienced shift, perhaps with a very experienced shift leader, such as the chief engineer Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, a man who knows the large power channel type reactors well, a man who knows the Chernobyl power plant very well, but also a rather irascible man, and of brusque and dictatorial manners. The problem is that a phone call arrives from Kiev that afternoon. It's the end of the month, the production budgets need to be closed, and what if the test caused a power outage and therefore a halt to production? What would happen? Someone would go knock on the door of Bryukhanov or his deputy Fomin, or both, and protest. Bryukhanov, who is waiting for a promotion to go to the ministry in Moscow. Fomin doesn't want trouble, who wants Bryukhanov's chair, doesn't want trouble. Dyatlov, who deep down wants to overthrow. Fomin doesn't want trouble. All three of them agree that the test needs to be done, but it shouldn't be done. That afternoon, Dyatlov talks with Bryukhanov and goes to sleep. He goes to sleep because he has already decided that he will go in with the night shift. He will supervise everything in the control room during the test. He will be the one directing the procedure. Bryukhanov also feels more at ease because Dyatlov may be a dictator, but he knows what he's doing. So even Bryukhanov and Fomin go to bed peacefully that night. The problem is that the night shift knows nothing about this. Alexander Fyodorovich Akimov, the person in charge of part of the night shift control room, doesn't know this. Many other technicians on duty that very evening don't know this. Toptunov, Stolyarchuk, Gershenbaum, they don't know. When Dyatlov arrives at the power plant at 23, the first thing he does is give a dressing down to Engineer Tregub, who is the outgoing shift supervisor of the evening shift. He wants to keep everyone in line and at maximum tension. Dyatlov wants maximum efficiency to close that damn test that has been postponed for too long. So he will do a favor for his bosses and also for himself, for his own career. Just after 1 a.m, the test begins. And from this moment forward, a series of events begins that will lead to disaster. Some of these without the staff knowing anything about it.
Technically, how did the accident happen?
So what happened is that they had to do a safety test that essentially required disconnecting the turbine from the cooling circuit to see if the turbine spinning by inertia could power the emergency cooling system. For a minute until the auxiliary generators kicked in. On the day of the test, the reactor had been brought to half power and had been kept at half power for quite some time. This had created a buildup of a material called xenon 135, which is a bit problematic because, let's say, it poisons the reactor, slows it down, the reactions. When they conducted the test, which was conducted at moonlight, the problems that occurred with the staff that was not prepared, among other things, because it should have been during the day, they postponed it to the night. Meanwhile, the workers changed shifts during the test. This accumulation of Xeno 135 sent the reactor into a stall, that is, the power dropped too low. To compensate for this, they removed all the control rods, creating a situation where the reactor is like a car without brakes. If you accidentally let a car without brakes go, put it on a downhill, you have a problem. Exactly what happened now. That is when they turned off the cooling pumps, the water started to vaporize the steam. It went on to create this feedback effect. So it increased the power boils more water, which creates more steam, which increases the power, and so on and so forth. So they lost control of the reactor. In an attempt to shut everything down, they pressed the emergency stop button, which, however, had a flaw, and that is the extenders of the control rods were made of graphite. We've seen that graphite helps, it promotes the reactions. Under normal conditions, the power, when the emergency stop was pressed, did this, so it rose slightly and then fell with the power already out of control. That rise there caused the deformation of the channels, and therefore the control rods no longer entered. And the system continued to increase power uncontrollably until the pressure blew off the plate that covered the
reactor in the
moment when the plate blew off, the reactor core came into contact with the air. The graphite, which was already overheated, caught fire because it came into contact with atmospheric oxygen. And so this caused the famous fire and the famous radioactive cloud. The smoke from the fire carried all the various radioactive particles generated, both inside the reactor and around.
We go far ahead. We go to about Monday the 24th. The situation has already deteriorated. It was a chain of negative events. We were saying that the reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny reactor has problems. It has a fatal flaw. It has not yet been discovered. This fatal flaw is a very high positive void coefficient. What does it mean? It's a ratio of steam filling to the volume that is normally occupied in the reactor by the mixture of liquid and steam produced by the nuclear reaction. On the other hand, what is a nuclear reactor for? In that case, to superheat the water through the fission of atoms to produce steam that turns the turbines that power the plant. It's very simple. The problem is that with a high positive void coefficient, that volume, which is usually occupied by water and steam, goes out of control. The technicians are unaware of another issue. They don't know that the presence of graphite, abundant because it's cheaper, is easier to produce. And reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny reactor, precisely because of the graphite, well, the graphite that should moderate, therefore keep the nuclear reaction under control, also leads to a contrary indication. That is the increase in the core temperature, a disproportionate increase in the absence of coolant.
Moreover,
In addition, the reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny reactor produces xenon. That xenon is normally burned by the reaction, but by continually lowering the operation, that xenon, instead of burning, accumulates. The reactor core ends up poisoned, as the technicians say, and the technicians themselves in the control room have proof of this, as they see the power drop just a few minutes after the start of the test. We're just at 30 megawatts. It's a power that doesn't even generate a small power plant. Dyatlov goes into a rage, starts yelling, shouting, insulting his subordinates, tells them they are idiots who have ruined the reactor. They have poisoned it. What's next? Precautions must be taken if the case is abandoned. The test should stop. Dyatlov doesn't want to know. He wants to close that damn matter. He promised his superiors, and he will do it at the cost of violating all safety procedures, even the most basic ones. Dyatlov himself doesn't know that all that Xeno 135 is masking the true power of the reactor. The reactor is actually not at 30 megawatt. That's a deception. The reactor is operating. The reactor is actually still very active. Dyatlov orders to pump water into the reactor, then to quickly extract all the control rods, except 6. This to favor a sudden acceleration of the resumption of nuclear activity and the return to the minimum operating mode, which is 200 megawatt. When the power supply to the hydraulic pumps is cut off, simulating a failure or sabotage, when the turbine is disconnected, when the pipes are left to fill with steam, reactor number 4 is no longer a controlled reactor. It's like a bomb that's been hooked up to a trigger. It's not a normal bomb. It's not just any device. It's like a dirty nuclear bomb. Something that, in addition to causing devastation, causes pollution. The steam clearly increases the reaction, makes it fast, makes it unstable. The result is that within a few seconds of the bars being removed, the power increases. Yes, but it doesn't stop at 200 megawatts. It goes up to 6 times the normal operating power. We are beyond the alert level. At that point, Engineer Akimov has only one way out. At least what he was taught in the training for running a reactor. Press the AZ5 button. It's a code name. It's the emergency button. It's the button that quickly reintroduces the control rods to moderate the reaction and therefore stop the reactor. But Akimov doesn't know that the AZ5 button
in that
moment with the control rods that have a graphite tip is the trigger's detonator. Akimov unknowingly pressed the button that detonates the bomb. As mentioned, the control rods are with a graphite tip. They're made of boron, but the tip is graphite. And when the graphite comes into contact with the reactor core, replacing the cooling water that has evaporated in the meantime, instead of reducing power, the power continues to increase. The nuclear fuel it is saturated with becomes critical. The reactor begins to melt, and the control rods can no longer enter. They get stuck. The reactor reaches 10 times the normal operating power, and at 124, there is a first explosion. The steam, at very high pressure, manages to unhinge and hurl into the sky. The extremely heavy 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid that covers the reactor itself. It unhinges this lid that destroys the roof of the plant, flies into the sky, and then falls back onto the reactor, leaving it partially exposed. And here a second explosion occurs because the contact between the hydrogen that is present in the air, we know, is part of our atmosphere, and the damaged core produces a second one. Huge explosion that is also felt a few kilometers away. In Pripyat, the dormitory city that serves as housing for the power plant staff and their families, the inhabitants are awakened. From this incredible bang, they see a column of blue light rising from the power plant. The mothers and children are almost fascinated by this column, like a light show. They leave their houses, look out the windows. Some go to the nearby railway bridge because it is said that you can see better from there, this column of light. Over the years, it will be discovered that exposure to that column of light, to the radiation, does nothing but cause death from cancer. Those who witness the column of light from the railway bridge will develop various neoplasms over the years, tumors due precisely to exposure to nuclear particles. The bridge will be called the Bridge of Death for this reason, and women and children will die. In Pripyat, meanwhile, the alarm sounds. The firefighters are mobilized. They are told that there has been a small fire at the power plant, to go there immediately with all the fire trucks and to get to work. However, no one warns the firefighters that they will be dealing with radioactive material, highly radioactive material. They are not given a radiation suit, a mask to filter the fumes from asbestos clothes. No, they are given nothing. And here the firefighters will die in a horrible way after a couple of weeks. They try in every way to put out that fire. They try to remove that strange material, those very strange stones they find at the site of the explosion. Stones that initially seem cold, but after a few seconds become scorching hot. It's graphite. Whoever touches it dies in horrible agony. After getting burned in the control room, we return inside the power plant. Dyatlov is convinced that his subordinates have made a real mess, that they made the water tank explode, but the tank didn't explode. And Dyatlov himself realizes this. Shortly after, when he leaves the control room and through a corridor, the windows of a corridor, he sees the graphite on the ground around the exploded building. But he says nothing. He lets the engineers inside the room continue to remain in uncertainty. Do you remember Kimov? Kimov keeps repeating, "I didn't do anything wrong. I followed the procedure. I don't know what happened." And Kimov, in tears, really doesn't know what to do. He and Toptonov make their way inside Building 4, looking for some colleagues who are missing. They will never find one because he was in the turbine room, the one above. The heavy reactor lid was blown away by the explosion. They find another one dying. They enter the reactor room and burn their faces in a few seconds. They see the fire, understand what happened, go back to Dyatlov, tell him what happened. Dyatlov doesn't believe it. He keeps telling them they are idiots who only blew up a tank, but it's still all their fault. Chimov can't find peace, but he understands that it's useless to insist. While Dyatlov is on the phone with Bryukhanov, he goes to report to Chimov and Toptonov. They descend into the semi-flooded, semi-destroyed basements, manually turn all the valves to try to get water into the exploded reactor, trying to extinguish the fire that way. But it will get even worse. Akimov, while turning the valves, will continue to cry, will continue to say that he can't understand what happened, that it's not his fault, that he did everything that the rules required. He can't know about all the defects of the BMK reactor. He can't know that reactor was pushed to its limit. He can't know that the orders that came for that test led to a disaster. Among other things, it's a disaster that was guiltily kept silent for a couple of days. The Soviet units say nothing, they don't minimize, they absolutely don't communicate anything. It takes a radiation alarm in Sweden for the Soviet Union to really take action. When the Swedes detect a spike in radiation, which does not come from their power plants but from the east, they alert the International Atomic Energy Agency, and only then does the Soviet Union admit that there has been an accident, but still minimizes and does not admit the real extent of the disaster. While specialists of all kinds are sent to the site to resolve the issue, helicopter pilots are sent, some die in the attempt to extinguish the fire by pouring sand and boron on it. Other technicians in radiation suits measure the extent of the catastrophe and see that we are off the scale. The reactor is exposed. It continues to burns for days, releasing into the atmosphere a lot of radioactive particles that contaminate the territory. It takes a lot to put out the fire, but it doesn't end there. Because the problem is that inside the reactor, it's still melting. And by melting, it risks entering the ground, polluting the water table, even generating another explosion that could wipe out half of Ukraine. So we need to act quickly. Dig a tunnel, position hydrogen heat exchangers, empty the room, flooded pumps. All this is done by the miners and the so-called liquidators. We should also clear the roof of the building. 4 of the graphite remains. But how do you remove the graphite? They try with the Lunokods, the famous robots sent by the Soviet Union to the moon, but in a queue, they break down one after the other. Because the radiation is too strong, it fries the microcircuits inside the robots. So they have to resort to human robots, that is, soldiers who are covered with lead suits, sent to the roof in shifts of a few seconds to shovel one after the other the remains of the graphite and throw them back into the reactor. It's a very risky practice, exposing young soldiers to the risk of carcinogenic diseases. Do you remember the firefighters? The firefighters are taken to Moscow. They are sick, then they seem to get better. And they have a terrible fall. Because the absorbed radiation is so strong that it destroys their bones, melts their skin, eats their organs. One by one, they perish inside, surrounded by destruction and agony. And Toptunov and Akimov also die. They too were hospitalized in Moscow. In his last days, Akimov no longer has a face. It's not a figure of speech. It has melted away. Toptunov loses his skin, loses mobility, even loses bodily functions. It's a horrible death. And how many like them will die in the following years, officially from illness? But the Soviet Union will never say how many deaths were caused by that radiation. How many people had to pay with their lives? An absurd mistake driven only by the greed of a few. A fear develops, the fear of the radioactive cloud, and it's a cloud that travels through Europe. The alarm reaches many countries, including Italy. Those who were adults at the time, but also those who were children, certainly remember the calls to civil protection. Do not stay outside, especially when the sky threatens rain. Do not let the children play outside. Do not consume fresh fruit, vegetables, and dairy products. Only consume canned meat, and jelly. Long-lasting foods that have passed through metal or aluminum that are believed to have shielded the radiation. It's a fear that grips everyone because the radioactive cloud is indistinguishable. You can't tell when it will arrive, if it will arrive, and what it will do.
The main radionuclides released were the fission products of uranium. So since uranium and plutonium are heavy elements, they don't move around much. Even if there is some particle in the radioactive cloud, it falls at a short distance. The ones that have moved around the most are the more volatile elements, so iodine, cesium, strontium, and so on. These elements have spread a bit everywhere, obviously. The main areas affected were Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, where these radionuclides contaminated these areas. They contaminated the waters, they contaminated the food, and then they had the consequences they had on the health of the people involved.
It will take years to understand exactly what happened at Chernobyl. Also because, in the meantime, the Soviet Union will try in every way to cover up many responsibilities, even in front of the International Energy Agency, at the cost of making the technicians lie. One of these, Negasov, will commit suicide several years later, overwhelmed by shame and guilt. But indeed, the legacy of Chernobyl, in addition to the great fear and the correction of the fatal error present in the reactor Bolshoi-Moshchnosty Kanalny reactors, will be a rediscussion of nuclear energy, of its role in our world. Think about the referendums that are proposed in Italy for the banning of nuclear energy, the closure of operating power plants. Well, this is the real legacy of Chernobyl, a poison legacy, a legacy that is difficult to accept.
Unwanted.
And yet it looms over us, and it's a legacy that cyclically returns. It comes back every time there is talk of a fire near the power plant, covered by various concrete sarcophagi over the years, which has come back in recent weeks with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With soldiers taking over the power plant and marching through the forests, which have become areas of
Prohibition, moving.
Nuclear particles that are recontaminating with radioactivity. Everything that surrounds, even for kilometers, that area now deemed compromised for centuries.
The level of radiation in the environment around Chernobyl now, at this moment, is precisely lower than at the time of the accident. Is it considered safe still, or is it a rather high level?
The level is higher than average. The radiation has spread in the area in a leopard spot pattern. So the average radioactivity of the area is not particularly high. Today, it's more or less equivalent to what you would find in central Italy, but there are hotspots where the radioactivity is much higher. For example, the Pripyat cemetery where they buried radioactive debris, the Pripyat hospital where there are still the firefighters' suits on which the soot from the fire has settled, highly radioactive and so on. In itself, the area is not uninhabitable today, but to live there, these hotspots would need to be precisely mapped and decontaminated. And it's obviously an expensive operation, which is not worth doing. Also because today, before the war, Chernobyl was at least a tourist site. For the rest, I repeat, the radioactivity is not such that it would compromise the survival of someone who should stay there for a while. So indeed, the area until before the war was a fairly visited tourist site.
But the safety now in nuclear power plants in 2022 and 1986. We can effectively talk about a new era regarding the safety of nuclear power plants.
Then, in fact, already in 86, most of the existing reactors in the world did not have these problems. Because, I repeat, the reactor Bolshoi-Moshchnosty Kanalny was a specifically modeled with some characteristics, including the production of plutonium. To have plutonium production, one must change the fuel very often. And so you have to leave the reactor uncovered to be able to intervene continuously. This was already not happening in Western reactors. It was already not happening in 86. Then, after Chernobyl, a new generation of reactors was developed with a particular focus on safety. The difference between the second and third generation nuclear is precisely the attention to safety. So not only could these things not have happened in the West already in 86, but today they are really out of reality. Today, nuclear power plants are among the safest things in existence.
Then there's the last tangible legacy, the ghost town Pripyat, a city that was supposed to be a model in the Soviet Union, a coveted city despite being closed, coveted because there was a better lifestyle, higher wages, opportunities for fun, opportunities to make a better life even for children. It has become synonymous with desert, ghost town, something abandoned in a hurry. There's a sign inside a classroom of the old school in Pripyat There's the date of April 27, 1986. With the writing, "We won't return goodbye." It's a note left by one of the teachers from that school. On the day of the evacuation, when the white and blue buses, preceded by cars with megaphones, arrive in Pripyat, they announce the need to temporarily evacuate the city. But no one is under any illusions. Everyone understood that they would never return. Pripyat will slip into oblivion. It will remain partially inhabited until almost the end of the 90s, but only by the liquidators. The workers who are employed to definitively shut down the power plant, who make use of some facilities like the old swimming pool for moments of leisure, but also moments of washing off the radiation. Pripyat has ceased to exist since then. You can't get in except for very special guided tours. Today, with the Russian invasion, you can't get in at all. Yet that warning remains, along with all the ruined buildings, the never-tested Ferris wheel in the amusement park, the forest, where entry is forbidden. They are all warnings. Man has made giant strides in scientific research, but sometimes his giant steps are reckless, and they lead, knowingly or not, to the edge of an abyss called self-destruction.
The current conditions of the plant, from the sarcophagus to the heart of reactor number 4, which blew up.
Yes, then there was the first containment, which was built immediately after the accident. Then a second, much larger sarcophagus was built, which was completed 2 years ago, which cost $1.5 billion. This is to prevent, it's not that the radioactivity is still there, that it's coming out. The fire has been over for a while now. What we want to avoid is that maybe when it rains, the rain can seep into the ground, carrying radioactive particles with it and maybe contaminate the groundwater. Now, the plant, obviously, reactor 4 is entombed under the sarcophagus, and they would like to proceed with the dismantling. There was a plan for the dismantling with an end date projected for 2063 because it's a long process. Now, obviously, there's a war going on, so who knows if and how these plans will be revised. As for the other 3 reactors at the plant, they continued to operate safely until 1993, 1 until 96, and 1 until 99. And these ones never had any problems. They're shut down. They're in the process of being dismantled like many other reactors around the world. And from this point of view, they don't present any particular problems.
You can talk about human error or construction and design error.
You can talk about various human errors and different construction and design errors. That reactor had design features that made it inherently less safe. Because, I repeat, it had been evaluated during the design phase that the risk-benefit ratio was still advantageous, in the sense that it was a reactor that you could use to produce plutonium. It was a reactor that you could operate with any type of fuel, natural enriched uranium, plutonium. It was a reactor that you could scale. It was a reactor that you could operate, that is, replace the fuel while it was running. So it had what is called online refueling, and it was a reactor that you could scale to unlimited powers. That is, you had this core, let's say, with the graphite channels. By adding channels, you increase the power of the reactor. You can do it without problems, whereas today a reactor with the pressure vessel cannot be enlarged. Once done, it's done. Despite being less safe, it was deemed not insurmountable after assessment. After Chernobyl, of course, it was decided that safety is much more important than anything else. And so today, these reactors are no longer built. In fact, let's say that modern reactors take no shortcuts. From this point of view, that is, safety is the absolute priority. Then there were flaws that went beyond the simple discussion of economy and practicality. There were flaws that were just flaws because no one had thought about those particular eventualities. An example is the graphite control rod extenders. Those were not necessary to operate the reactor economically or to produce plutonium or anything like that. They were simply cheap. From that point of view, therefore, you put this stuff. It doesn't create particular problems, like an extender to the control rods, you have to put it. It does it in graphite, which is the same material that you have in the channels, and you say it's fine like that. In reality, in that circumstance, it was then the straw that broke the camel's back, causing the disaster.
titles made by the Amara community.
Thank you all for watching the video.
Thank you all for watching the video.
Thank you all for watching the video. Thanks for watching. Thank you all.